Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Gimel, continuing on in Masechet Eruvin. Today's daf is sponsored by Debbie and Howard Jacoby Rubin in honor of our wives, mothers, aunts, sisters, and daughters from whom we have learned so much. And by Joyce Ben David in honor of Gail Stechler and Dina Levy for spearheading the Tina Kadron group. It was an honor to celebrate the Siyum from Masechet Shabbat with them. Thank you. And by Tamar Wenekor Hartmeyer to my Chavruta Jeremy Rudler in honor of our Siyum Masechet Chagiga on Sunday. Mazel tov on starting graduate school this fall. Delaware is lucky to have you. So we're now going to go back and review very briefly what we saw yesterday. We saw that a mavoy that's larger than 20 amma and wider than 10 has to be limited. According to the rabbis, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no problem. Rav tried to say that the rabbis are based on the hechal, the opening of the hechal, and the sanctuary, and Rabbi Yehuda was based on the opening of the ulam. We eventually rejected that and said, no. Rav is based on, the rabbis are based on the Echal, but Rabbi Yehuda is based on palaces in general. And it's not limited necessarily to 40 exactly, height of 40, but it's general. Then we started to ask some questions. We started with, and this is, you can see charted on the sheet, I charted out the first two, even though we did them in yesterday's daf. We have questions on Rav that said that the rabbis learned from the entrance to the Hechal. If so, why don't we learn it exactly like the entrance to the Hechal? So, for example, if the Hechal had doors, why don't we insist that there's doors? Secondly, if the Hechal had, and then we answered because the doors were just there for tzniut purposes, for privacy. Then we said, if in the Hechal it had a width of 10 and it's Surat Petach because it had, an opening to the doorway, it was like a gateway where it had what we call it Surat Petach. Then we'd say that. Why did the Mishnah say that if it's wider than 10, you don't need to be lima'et if it has a tzurat petach? Once you have a tzurat petach, according to the Mishnah, there's no reason to be even wider than 10. To which the Gemara answered that basically Rav had a different version of our Mishnah, and it actually said that you do need to make it narrower. That was where we ended yesterday. So starting now with the last two words on bet and mudbet. Elame'ata lo tehanile amaltera. Well, then, it seems like if you have a very beautifully decorated beam at the top, it shouldn't help. Even if it's higher than 20, that shouldn't work. Daha, why would we assume that? Daha hechal amaltra havyale. The hechal, the entrance to hechal, there were these beams that were decorative beams. We'll see exactly what they were a little bit further on. And yet they made sure when they put these beams in at the entranceway of the Echal, they were lower than 20 amma. They weren't above the entranceway, they were within the 20 amot. And here they were these fancy devices. Now, what's the whole idea here? The idea is if it's something very noticeable, then people will notice it even at a greater height. So if that's the case, then again, if we're going to learn it from the Hechal and the amalterot there were lower than 20 amma, then we should learn here also, even an amaltera would have to be lower than 20 amma. Ditznan. How do we know this was in the Mikdash? It says in Masechet Midot, where it describes all the description of things that were in the Beit HaMikdash. Chamesh amaltrot shel milah hayu al gavav. Zo lamala mizo. Zo lamala mizo. Each one was a little bit higher than the other. They jutted out a little bit more, all by the entranceway. There were these beams that were in the entranceway to the Hechal, and basically they were these decorative items on the wall. Again, we're going to see exactly what they were. V'haimai tiyuvta. So now what are we going to say? This is a question. What, you want to raise this as an issue? Dilma, maybe it means kitanya hida amaltrot beulam tanya. Maybe when it talked about these amaltrot, maybe it meant the amaltrot in the ulam, meaning maybe these were on the ceiling where the ulam was and not where the hechal was, which would mean that they'd be at a height of over 20. Because remember that ulam was much taller. It was 40. So maybe you could prove it from there. So then they say, right? Maybe they're saying maybe the hechal was just like the ulam and they also had these. Well, if so, alama amar Rabbi Eli amarav rechava arba'a afa pi she'ena bri'a v'im yesh la amaltera afilu gavoha yoter me-20 amma eino tzarich lema'et. Sorry, I need to go back for a quick minute. The Gemara had asked, "My tiyufta dilma kitanya hu da amalterot beulam tanya." Right? Maybe the amalterot are in the ulam. and not in the Heichal at all, in which case it doesn't teach us anything about the 20 amma height. So then they say, V'hai mai kushya, why is this a question? Dilma tavnit Heichal ke tavnit ulam. It's not really a question because in here the Dilma, the Mefarshim say the Dilma is a little bit problematic. Dilma means perhaps, but if it's perhaps, it wouldn't really be an answer. But what they mean is they had a tradition that the Heichal was just like the Ulam, and again, then you have it that they were Amalterot in the Heichal, in which case they were below 20, in which case this would teach us that the Amalterot, even if it's very decorative, it would be under 20 amma. So then the Gemara says, if that's the case, then Alama Amma, this is back to our question about Rav. Alama Amma Rabbi Ila Amma Rav, if really we're going to learn this all from the Heichal, according to him, Rechava Arba'a Afal Pi She'ena Bria, number one halacha. If it's 4 wide, even if it's weak, meaning if it's not a good beam, but it is 4 wide, that can serve us as a beam. Ve'im yesh la amaltera afilu, that part isn't really important for our purposes, but here's the important line. Ve'im yesh la amaltera afilu gvoha yoter me-20 amma eino tzarich lema'et. But if it has an amaltera, a very decorative element, even if it's higher than 20 amma, it doesn't need to be limited. Okay, it doesn't need to be brought lower. So now what do we say? We started with, now this really contradicts, because we said if we're going to learn it from the Heichal, it seems like an Amaltera still needs to be under 20 because that's where it was in the Heichal. And yet here we learn that it doesn't, it can be even above 20. So Amar Rav Yosef, Amaltera matnitehi, man katanela. This source that you just brought, that Rabbi Ila says in the name of Rav, and the problem was that Rav himself said it. That was really the problem. So comes Rav Yosef and he says, that wasn't said in the name of Rav. That's a Braita. And who's the author of that Braita? Meaning, we don't know that that's a valid Braita. Now, often people brought Braitot. They remember them by heart. He says, somebody brought this Braita, but who's to say that it's a valid Braita? And basically, we can throw it out, and therefore we don't have a question. That was his attempt at answering this. But Abaye says, Amar Abaye, what are you doing, Rav Yosef? We know who brought this. And he's a legit person, and this is a valid Braita. But he says, V'tehave amaltera matnita v'tikshe l'rav. And then the amaltera really is a Braita. It says they can be higher than 20. And that seems to contradict Rav, who says we learn it all out from the Heichal, which would seem under 20. It would have to be under 20, even decorative. So Amar lecha Rav, here comes our answer. Dal ana mehacha matnita milo kashina hadade says, why are you questioning me? Don't the Braito contradict themselves? And therefore, elamai lach lememar tinaihi, l'didinami tinaihi. These Braito contradict each other. Why? We had already the Braito we saw yesterday that Rav Chisda said. Rav Chisda brought it, I believe, and he said that it says there that the Chachamim learn it out from the Pitcho Shel Heichal. That seems to contradict this Braita, which says that above 20 would be a problem, wouldn't be a problem. And if we learn it from the Heichal, from the other Braita, above 20 would be a problem, even in a Maltara. So Rav says, don't look at me. It's not me who's contradicting. The Braita themselves contradict each other. And therefore, he says it must be a Machloka Tanaim. And that's what I'll answer also. I hold by a different opinion. But Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, below Rav, matniat ahada de lo kashin. If we didn't have Rav in the picture, we would have a different resolution to the contradiction. What would we say? L'Rabbanan kora tama mai mishum hekera. Ahai dekatani yeter mipitcho shel Heichal simana ba'alma. Really, the reason for the rabbis is because it's a heker. It's a siman. It's something noticeable. I talked about this yesterday. It's just for us to see visually that there's a break here. Why does it say, and then obviously what? It has to be lower than 20 because above 20 we don't see anything. The fact that it says in the Braita, mipitcho shel Heichal, is just a simana ba'alma. It's just a way to remember it. It's a mnemonic device. So now they want to address this approach. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak hanicha ilo sfira liha de Rabba. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak makes sense if you don't hold by Rabba, which we're going to have to see what that is. We don't yet know. Ela isfira liha de Rabba, Amar Rabba. Okay, what did Rabba say? We're basically going to say it makes sense that he says the whole logic here is all about heker, and that's why above 20. If, again, then it's going to explain. If it's in a Maltara, the whole problem with the Maltara was if we learn it from the Mishkan, from the Mikdash, then we're going to say it has to be even below 20. But once we say we don't learn it from the mikdash, that's just a way to remember, then we say very simply, it all depends. If it's very decorative and beautiful, then everyone will notice it, even if it's above 20, and therefore it's okay. But if it's not decorative, then it has to be below 20. And then we don't actually have any contradiction. So now they say that's all if you don't hold by Rabbah. But what does Rabbah say? What does it say by sukkah? What's the purpose of sitting in a sukkah? So you remember that our forefathers dwelled in the sukkot. Because people's eyes don't see things so high up, therefore you're not going to remember that you're sitting in a sukkah, and therefore it can't be so high. Now, if that's the case, that sounds like the exact same logic by the mavoi, but the logic is a little bit counterintuitive. It says, if you hold like Rabbah, then you don't need to say it. Alma gabe sukkah nami behekera pligi, if legu betarte, if legu betarte lamali. Why do we need to say that they also debate the issue by mavoi? It should be obvious. This is saying it's true that they have the same debate by mavoi, but it doesn't make sense that our Mishnah would say so when it's the exact same machloka by sukkah. Once we know it by sukkah, since the logic is the same, the logic should apply, we shouldn't need to say anything. And therefore, it only makes sense if we don't, and it's counterintuitive, if we don't hold like Rabbah that that's the reason, then we'd have to say here it's unique, and it's because we want people to notice it. And then you'd have to explain, right? It's a little bit counterintuitive. Anyway, moving on. So what do we say? Because in fact, we don't have to worry about it, because in the end, they're going to explain it is according to Rabbah. And he had to say it by sukkah, and they needed to say it here. Why? Because you might not have thought you could learn one from the other. Sricha, you need both. If you just had it by sukkah, you would have said, Bahaka amar Rabbi Yehuda, kevan dili yeshiva avda shalta be'ena. You would have said, that's where Rabbi Yehuda says, since the sukkah, generally you sit in it, so Rabbi Yehuda says you're going to see something. If you're inside sitting in the sukkah, you're going to notice what's above you. Aval mavoi, but mavoi, you're walking through the mavoi. While you're walking, you don't look up at the ceiling. You're looking in front of you on the ground. Therefore, maybe they would say that mavoi does need to be below 20. What if you just have by mavoi? You would have said, that's where when you're walking, it needs to be below 20. But maybe sukkah, aval bahach, by sukkah where you're sitting in it, maybe you'd notice it even at a high height. They might have agreed with Rabbi Yehuda that even higher is okay. Sricha. That's why you need both. Now we get back to, I said we get to this, Maya Maltra. What was this decorative element in the Mikdash? It was these bird nests that were made out of wood that were hung on the wall there. He said, when he came from Eretz Yisrael and he brought Torah to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, he said, listen, in Eretz Yisrael they say, Eretz Yisrael is considered the Ma'arava in the West, Paske de Arza. They were beams of cedar wood, meaning they were very special beams, and that's why they were noticeable. So one says it was these bird decorative elements, these bird nests, and the other one said it was beams of cedar wood. So, Manda Amar Paske de Arza Kol Sheken Kine. If you say these cedar beams, then you would say all the more so if they were these birds and bird nests, that would be much more noticeable. But if you say it was the birds, you wouldn't necessarily think that people would notice a special beam of Erez, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily say that. Because it attracts attention. So then they say, but my sukkah, by the beams. What makes these beams noticeable? What makes the beams noticeable is that they're particularly long. So then you could say also by the sukkah, it's particularly long a sukkah, right? It's much bigger than just a beam. And therefore, if by sukkah, it also would be noticeable that you would be in the sukkah. And therefore, they say, V'kamri Rabbanan Delo, but yet the rabbis still say it's not good that they're 20 amot high. So what did they answer? Ela kevan de kachashiv it le kala. It's not because of that. It's because they're important. People talk about them. And if people talk about them, then people notice them. What if you have a case where the beam has a certain thickness and the bottom part of the beam is within 20 and the top part of the beam is above 20? This is a classic Gemara nitpicky question, right? What does it mean lemala me'esrim? Does it mean the beam has to be fully above the 20 amma of space in order for it to be problematic and not to work? Or is it enough for it to be that part of the beam is above that space that it would be a problem? So now comes the Gemara. Amar Rava. So here again, miktzat korah b'toch esrim miktzat, right? And miktzat schach b'toch esrim u'miktzat schach lamala me'esrim. Same thing about the schach. What if some of the schach, the lower part, was below 20 and the higher part was above? Amar Rabba b'mavoi kasher b'sukkah pasul. Rabba says, and this is the first version of Rabba, in the mavoi it works, in a sukkah it doesn't work, and we're going to have to see why. So ma'ishna b'mavoi de kasher. So the first assumption is the amrinan klosh sukkah. As we say, imagine as if, right, in the mavoi it's kasher, sorry, the amrinan klosh, we view it as if we weaken the top part, as if it's not there. And then you're left with, it's under 20. Well, if that's the case, sukkanami, lema klosh. Why don't we say the same thing? View the beam as if, right, view the schach as if the top half is as if it's not there. And then we just have the bottom half and that should work. So the Gemara says, no, that wouldn't work because it's a big debate about how to understand this and why it's necessarily the case. So I'll try to explain it in one or two ways. If you take off the top layer, the assumption is either that what's left on the bottom part is spread out and you don't actually have, you need to have more shade than sun. And in this case, you'd have more sun than shade, although it doesn't make so much sense because theoretically the assumption is the schach covers everything and it's just a matter that there's a thick layer of it. So if you take off the top layer, theoretically it should still be okay. What some people say is that when you take off the top part, the bottom part will spread out and then you'll end up with more sun than shade. And that's why sukkah is different than mavoi. But then they say, no, throw the question back on mavoi. If you take off the top part of the beam, it's going to be a beam that's so light that it could blow away by the wind, and therefore it's also not going to be considered valid. So how, again, we're stuck with, why do we make this distinction? Ela al korchacha, you'd have to say that how does the beam work? Na'asu kishipudim shel matechet, and therefore, meaning we're going to view it as if it's full of metal and it's strong. Hachanami al korcha, and then we'd have to say the same thing by sukkah. It must be where there's enough schach to cover even by the bottom layer. So therefore, we're stuck with there's really no distinction. So Amar Rava, now we're going to have two different answers. Amar Rava mipraxia, sukkah de liyachidhu lo midka. Since an individual sits in a sukkah, he's not going to remember. This takes us back to things we saw on Shabbat. When it's one person, no one's going to remind him. When it's two people, one will remind the other. We saw this with a candle. We saw it with a few other cases. So now they say, but mavoi de l'rabim, but since the mavoi is for public use, midkarei ahadadi, they'll remind each other. And therefore, what's less noticeable for an individual will be more noticeable for more people, and they'll remind each other, and we won't have this problem that people might carry outside. That's the first answer. And as we tried the answer of Kalush, we rejected it. This is the second answer. This answer stays. And the third answer is another possibility. Rabina Amar, Sukkah de'oraita echmiru ba'rabanan. Mavoi de'rabanan lo echmiru be'rabanan. Because Sukkah is a halacha de'oraita, therefore the halacha is more stringent. Since Mavoi is de'rabanan, this goes back to what we saw yesterday, therefore the rabbis are not stringent. Now we're going to see the exact opposite. And now we're going to have to take all the logic we just said and flip it on its side. This happens very often in the Gemara, where it basically proves to you that you can convince anybody of anything and you can flip anything on its side. He learned the whole statement of Rabba in the opposite way. Amar Rabba, b'mavoi pasul b'sukkah kshera. Dafka by mavoi, it doesn't work if it's part and part, above and below 20. And by sukkah, it works. Maishna sukkah dikshera. So now you have to start from the beginning. Why is sukkah good? Tamrinan klosh, right? Because you must say, we view the top as if it's not there, and therefore it works. But b'mavoi nami lema klosh, right? So why don't we say the same thing by mavoi? So they say, ikalash havela korani telepiruach. Well, if you cut off the top half and view it as if it's not there, then we're going to end up with a beam that could blow away with the wind. But hachanami, same thing you could say by sukkah. If we take away the top layer, it's going to be that the sun is going to be more than the shade. So we're going to have to say that we view this all as if it's solid and it's not going to be an issue, because if it was an issue for one, it would be an issue for the other. So comes in again, Amar Rava mipraxia. Now he's going to have to say the exact opposite logic. Sukkah de liyachidhi rame anafshe. If it's your own, you're going to pay attention. Umidkar, and you'll remember. Why? Well, we'll see in a minute. Mavoi de lerabimhi samche hadade. The lo midkare. When it comes to something public, everyone's going to rely on everybody else and think somebody else is doing it. And in the end, no one's going to do it. This is classic, right? If you know you're the only one responsible, you'll make sure to be on it. But if you think that there's lots of people who might do it, you're just going to say, oh, someone else will do it. And therefore, and here's a quip, an adage they used to say, if you have a pot that's owned by a number of people together, it doesn't get warmed up and it doesn't get cooled down. In other words, nobody takes care of it. Nobody chills it and nobody heats it up. And it just doesn't get taken care of. So here you see, we took what we thought before. The more people, the more they'll remind each other. Here it's specifically the opposite. Ravina Amar, and he's going to say again the exact opposite that we saw before. Sukkah de'oraita lo ba'yechizuk. Mavoi de Rabbanan ba'yechizuk. This is very interesting. Normally we'd say, oh, we're more stringent when it comes to Torah law. This is saying the opposite. When it comes to Torah law, the rabbis didn't need to make as many boundaries because people are very careful about it. But when it comes to Rabbanan laws, rabbinic laws, we're worried people won't take them seriously, and therefore we have to be much more careful. And therefore, if it's partially above, partially below, we're going to say that's no good, so that they don't think that when we do it fully above, it'll be a problem. So that means really theoretically it's okay, but we want to make sure that nobody comes to think when it's totally above, it's okay when it comes to the rabbinic law, and therefore we're going to be more stringent with that. So in the end, they say, my havela. So now we have two opposite versions of Rabba. What's the situation? So Rabba bar of Ula Amar, Zev Zeh Pasul. Rabba Amar, Zev Zeh Kasher. We now have four different versions, basically. We have two different versions. One that says Mavo is allowed, Sukkah it's not. One that says the opposite. And now when it came to Halacha L'Maaseh, we have one saying both are the same, and the other saying, both are the same. One saying stringent, one saying lenient. Okay, so we now have a lot of different versions. I don't think anybody really thought that he said it in both, but that both are pasul or both are kasher. But when it came halacha l'maaseh, we had to be either more stringent or we decided to be more lenient and at least say the same by both. So now we're left with a debate between Rabba bar of Ula and Rava about whether it's kasher for Mavo and Sukkah or not. Okay, now we're going to have strengthening Rava's opinion. Halal sukatnan, halal mavoitnan. He says, right, the reason why it's kasher, because it says when it's talking about lamala me'esrim, it's talking about the esrim ama is the halal, is the space. And therefore, both in the mavoit and in the sukkah, it's a matter of how much space. And therefore, both are kasher as long as you don't have 20 amma of space. And that makes sense with the heker. It's all a matter of can you see it? And if the bottom part is within 20, then we assume you can see it. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava. So now Rav Papa says to Rava, Tanya de Mesayalach. I'm going to bring a brighter that proves what you said. Mavoy shu gavoa me'eschim amma yoter mipitcho shel ulam. If you have a mavoy that's higher than 20 amma, more than the entrance to the hechal. Sorry, I think I said ulam. I meant bipitcho shel hechal yimaet. So now it says it has to be more than the open, right, the entranceway. What's the space? The space is 20. So as long as it's less than that, it's fine. So meaning if you don't have a space of 20 because the bottom of your beam is within 20, that should be fine. Rav Shimi bar Rav Ashi le Rav Papa. But now Shimi bar Rav Ashi brings a question on this. Brings the following source. You put your beam from the edge of esrim and further down. So now they say, what does it seem to imply? According to this, it has to be even lower than 20. So if it's within 20, if it's how do we say this? This source says that the way you're supposed to do it is put it from the bottom of esrim ulamata. So it sounds like it has to be within 20 and not above. In other words, this is focusing on the korah and where the korah has to be rather than Rava, who said as long as you don't have 20 of space. The focus was on the space. Here, the focus is on where the beam has to go. So what do they say? Ema ulamala. They say, no. Read it as from 20 and above. Meaning, according to Rava, as long as, right, then it would work. As long as you don't have 20 of space, it's fine. So then the Gemara says, V'halamata katani. How could you say that lamata, below, means lamala, right? 20 and above. So they say, no, hakamashvan. This is what it means. De lamata kilamala. Mala. Now we're going to talk about, there's minimum height and maximum height. We've only been talking about the maximum. There's also a minimum height. Lamata doesn't mean from 20 amot and below that, meaning, right, it has to be within the 20 amot. And it wouldn't work if the beam was above 20. No, that's not what it means, because that would prove the other side. It means lemala, right? Misvat esrim, period, or comma, and lemata. And when it comes to the maximum, the minimum height, it has to be at the bottom, lemata. That also is the same. What does that mean? So, Mahakamashwan dilamata kilamala. At the bottom, it's like at the top. Malamala halala esrim, af lamata halala asara. The bottom has to be minimum of 10 tefachim of height. Now, what does this mean? It means that it has to be, your beam has to be at a height of above 10, not at 10, but above 10. And your other beam can be anywhere as long as your space isn't, right? You have to have a space of 10 tefachim at the bottom before you can start your beam. And you have to have a space of 20, as anywhere up to a space of 20 you can have. As long as it's less than 20 above, your beam can still be there. So there we've proven that Rava could be correct. Amar Abaye Mishmei de Rav Nachman. Now we're going to start a new thing, which is going to take us till the end of today and continuing on through tomorrow. Amar Abaye Mishmei de Rav Nachman. Amat sukkah va'amat vavoy, va'amat bat chamisha. Amat kilayim va'amat bat shisha. What's an amma? A cubit. Right? It's the space from your hand to your elbow. Okay, like this part of your arm, from your wrist to your elbow, I believe it is. So the idea of an amma, now they measured it, not generally, they didn't take everybody's arm, but they generally had that. The idea is it goes by, each amma measures 5 handbreadths, okay, or 6 handbreadths. Sometimes they talk about an amma being 5. Sometimes they talk about an amma being 6. This is because some people have bigger arms and some people have smaller arms, and there's 2 different types of ways of measuring a cubit. Is it with 5 or is it with 6? So now they say, well, it depends what you're measuring your amma for. An amma, when it comes to sukkah and mavoy, is 5. When it comes to kilayim, which we're going to talk about, that's crossbreeding, different. It's the idea of planting within your vineyard grains that grow in the ground, vegetables, is a problem. So they can't be within a certain amount of each other. We're going to see a bunch of different laws about this. So when we talk about kilayim, we're talking about an amma bat shisha. Amat mavoy ba'amma bat chamisha l'may hilchata. What's the halacha? Ligovho u'lepirtzat mavoy. It's for the height and for making an opening in the mavoy. Okay, what does this mean? Again, the height 20 amma. So it has to be, when you measure 20 amma, it's a height of 5 handbreadths to an amma. So that would be, again, that would be more stringent, because if it's shorter, which it'll be if it's based on a 5 handbreadth amma, then we're going to be more stringent. Pirtzat mavoy means if one of the walls is open and has an opening of 4 amma wide, and I'm sorry, I think it's 10 amma wide, then we're not going to be able to use that mavoy. We're not going to be able to put an eruv in the mavoy. If you look in Rashi says, Pirtzat mavoy, the kamalan b'hai pirka, Pirtzat mavoy b'yud amot pasile. If the mavoy is breached on one of the sides by 10 amot, then you can no longer put an eruv in that mavoy, because one of the walls is basically open. So it's 10 amot. I said before I wasn't sure. Now I see in Rashi it says 10. So again, when we measure the mavoy, the measurements of amma for a mavoy and for a sukkah, okay, we're going to use the 5 amma one. This is going to be stringent, because we're going to end up saying, oh, if your pirtzah, again, imagine it's 10 amot times 5 handbreadths, that's 50. If we say it's 6 handbreadths, then we'll get to 60 handbreadths would be, we're basically going to be more stringent by saying even at 50, it's already no good. So now they say, amat mavoy mavoy. V'ha'ika meshech mavoy ba'arba amot dilakula. But wait, When it comes to how long, if a mavoi is less than 4 amot, if the walls of the mavoi are less than 4 amot, then we're going to say that you can't make an eruv in that mavoi. Okay, we're going to get to this later. It's going to come up, I think it's on Daf Hey. Yeah, on Daf Hey, we're going to learn this more in depth. We'll deal with it then. But if it's 4 amot, then you can't put a mavoi in. You can't put a shitufei mavoot. You can't fix it with an eruv. So now we say, well, that is going to actually be more lenient, because we're going to say 4 amot would have to be, right, if it's 20 handbreadths, then, right, once it gets to 20 handbreadths, you can already use it and fix the mavoi. So here you have, if we go with a 5 handbreadth one, we're actually going to be more lenient. So what do they say? Well, there's a machloket about that 4. Some people say it's 4 cubits. Some people say it's 4 handbreadths. Now, if we say it's, right, and we're going to say, Kiman Damar, Ba'arba'at Tfachim. If you say it's 4 Tfachim, 4 handbreadths, then this amount has absolutely, this is not an amma and a mavoi, because it doesn't have anything to do with a cubit. There's no measurement of a cubit relating to it. So we say he must hold by that. When Abaye said in the name of Rav Nachman that the amma of a sukkah and an amma of a mavoi is 5 to be, basically the idea here, let me just make it clear. What Abaye is basically saying is, we're going to measure it by 5 if that's going to make the law more stringent. We're going to measure it by 6 if that's going to make the law more stringent. So either we say it's arba'at tfachim, it has nothing to do with amot, and then it's not an amma relating to mafoi. Or ibayit ema ba'arba amot, maybe it is arba amot, but when he said we're going to go by the 5 handbreadth cubit, when it comes to mavoi, he meant virov amot ka'ama. He didn't mean all the amot of mavoi. He meant most of them, like the height and like the width of a pirza, but not the size of the minimum size of a mavoi, where it would actually end up being more lenient. Again, we're going to go and say amat sukkah, ba'amat bat chamisha, l'may hilchata. So what's the halacha? Number 1, ligopa, again, the height of 20, which is going to be, again, more stringent. If we say it's going to be a lower height, that's going to actually be disqualified if it's a 5 handbreadth amma. Ula dofen akuma. Dofen akuma is when you have a wall of a sukkah and then you have the schach. The schach is supposed to be attached to the wall. If you end up with problematic schach that's within 4 amot of the wall, if it's within 4 amot, then we assume that it's all just attached to the wall and it's fine. If it's more than 4 amot, then it's going to be a problem. So again, if we say 4 amot, when does it become a problem? When smaller amot, right? If we say it's a 5 handbreadth amot, then we're going to be more stringent and say, if it's 4 amot, which is a narrower space, and it's problematic after 4 amot, more than 4 amot, we're going to disqualify the sukkah. V'ha'ika, but then they say, wait, but meshach sukkah ba'arba amot. But then what about the minimum size of a sukkah? The minimum size of a sukkah has to be 4 amot. If we say it's a smaller amount, then again, we're being more lenient. So they say, Ditanya, Rebbe Omer, well, it must be, he goes according to Rebbe, who says, Omer hani, kol sukkah she'en ba arba amot al arba amot psula. Sorry, this is lekula, because he says if it doesn't have 4 by 4 amot, it's going to be disqualified. So again, it will be more lenient if we go by the smaller measurement. So they answer, Kirabanan. Abaye must hold, or Abaye says Rav Nachman holds, like the rabbis, the Amrei afilu ena machzeket ela rosho v'rubo v'shulchano. The measurement has nothing to do with cubits, the minimum size. It has to hold, goes by, has to hold your head and most of your body and a table. That's the minimum size, and has nothing to do with cubits, in which case that's not any sort of leniency. It's not a problem. V'bait ema, or like we said before, olam Rebbe, maybe he does hold like Rebbe. The rov amot ka'amar, he means the majority of amot, not all the amot by sukkah, but most of them, the ones that go stringent. Amat kilayim ba'amat bat shisha l'may hilchatan. Now, what's about this amat kilayim being an amat bat shisha? Again, we're going to have to find something where we're being more stringent about it by saying that the measurement is 6 handbreadths to an amma instead of 5. Now, in kilayim, the issue is going to be how separate the things have to be. So let's read. L'karachat hakerem u'lemachol hakerem. Okay, let's explain what this is. Ditnan. Karachat hakerem Beit Shammai omrim 24 amot. Ubeit Hillel omrim 16 amot. If you have a blank space, a space that nothing's growing, it's a karachat, like bald, a bald space in the middle of a kerem. How big is that space going to be to call this its own field, to allow us to plant crops here and not have to worry about kilei hakerem? right? About mixing the grains with the vineyard. So Beit Shammai says you need 24 and Beit Hillel says you need 16. Okay, why is this? Because we're going to see, we're going to read it more in depth inside. Umachol kerem, okay, machol is from the word dance. So now we're going to talk about, there we have, the first case was there's a kerem on the outside, a vineyard, and we have a space in the inside that we want to plant. Now we have the opposite, where the vineyard is in the middle, and we have a space around it that we want to plant. So this space, Beit Shammai omrim 16 amot, or Beit Hillel omrim 12 amot. So ezui karachat hakerem, what is, okay, so let's just explain. Beit Shammai says you need the space on the outside to be 16 amma wide, and Beit Hillel says 12 amma is enough. So ezui karachat hakerem, kerem shecharev emtzaito, as I said, there's nothing in the middle. Ein sham 16 amot, lo yavi zera l'sham. You have to have at least minimum of 16 in order to plant something. Why? Hayu sham 16 amma, so let's say there's 16. Noten lo kedei avodato, you need space for the animals to go around. The oxen would plow and do all sorts of work, so that needs to be 4 amot. So if you have a space of 16, and it's a square, so 4 amot on either side, which basically takes away 8 amot, because 4 on one side, 4 on the other, and then you're left with a square of 8 by 8. Okay, that's a big enough size. Noten lo kedei avodato v'zorea et hamutar. Then, because it's an 8 by 8 size in the middle, that's enough to be called a field in and of itself, and you can plant there. So that was one opinion. Remember, there was either 24. According to Beit Shammai, it has to be 24 because it can't. 8 by 8 is not enough. It would have to be, according to him, 24 minus 8 would get 16. It would be 16 by 16. Right? I know something doesn't sound right here. Let me quickly measure it out. You would end up with, if the space, you left 4 on either side, so that would minus 8, and you had 24 to begin with. So 24 minus 8 would be 16. Right. According to this, right, that would be 16 by 16. And if it was 16 to begin with, then you'd subtract 8 and you'd have 8. Oh, I was right. So either 16 by 16 or 8 by 8. Now we say, what's the machol kerem? בין כרם לגדר אין שם 12 אמה, לא יביא זרע לשם. היו שם 12 אמה, נותן לו כדי עבודתו וזורע את השאר. So now they say, okay, again, if you have from the vineyard to, and then you have this space around and you want to plant there, and then there's a wall. So generally they didn't plant within 4 amot of the wall, and you would have to leave space around the vineyard 4 amot. So if on either side you have 12, that's enough, because minus 4 of the space that you need in between the vineyard, minus 4 of the space between the wall and where you want to plant, because nobody would plant that close to the wall. So you have a width, you minus 8, you started with 12, so you end up with a space of 4 amot wide. That's enough to do a field on the side. According to the other opinion, you would need to have, we said 16, right? We said 12, right, or 16. He says you need a minimum of 8 in order to plant. In other words, it would have to be 16 minus the 4 minus the 4, and then you're left with 8. So now, again, what's the relevance of all this? Now, in this case, if we say the amma is 6 handbreadths instead of 5, that's going to be more stringent because you're going to need more space. So now they're going to ask, like they did on the others, but there's a case where if we use the bigger amma, it's actually going to be a leniency. What's that? Ba'arba amota lekula. Right, then it will be more lenient. Tnan, as it says in the Mishnah, kerem hanatua al pachot me'arba amot, Rabbi Shimon omer eno kerem. If you have a vineyard that's planted on less than 4 amot, okay, meaning you don't have 4 amot in between each row, Rabbi Shimon omer eno kerem. This isn't even considered a kerem because you've planted everything too close together. The chachamim omrim kerem. Chachamim still say this is a kerem. According to Rabbi Shimon, you planted them so close together, it's not even considered a vineyard because things aren't going to grow properly. And therefore, it's actually funny, you're not going to be obligated if you plant other things there. But Chachamim say, no, that's a kerem. What you do is if you have a few rows and they're next to each other, you view the middle row that's basically making it less space as if it's not there. And you could say, oh, look, we have 4 amot in between each row, and this is a real kerem. So, but now, according to Rabbi Shimon, what happens? It's not a kerem. And now if we say it has to have 4 amot in between each row, so if we say we have the bigger amot, we're actually going to end up with a leniency, because as long as it's not that big space, we can say this isn't a kerem and you can plant whatever you want there. So what do they say? Either we say Kirabanan de Amre Have Kerem. So either you could say we hold like the rabbis, and they don't think it's a kerem, and therefore there's no leniency here. It's the exact same structures we keep having. We mean it's the majority of amot. Majority of cases of kilayim were more stringent, but maybe sometimes it's a leniency. In the leniency case, we're going to go and make it more stringent and go by the 5 amma and not the 5 handbreadth amma and not the 6. We'll end with this one line. That was all Abaye in the name of Rav Nachman. So let's just go back and remind you. Abaye said in the name of Rav Nachman, the Amat Sukkah and the Amat Mavoy is the Amat Bat Chamisha. We go by the 5 handbreadth one. And when it comes to Kilayim, we go by the 6. But Rabbi Mishmei Rav Nachman, he had a different version of what Rav Nachman said. Amar Kol Amot Ba'Amah Bat Shisha. We always calculate by a 6 handbreadth Amma. Ela Halalu Shochakot V'Halalu Atzevot. We do make this distinction, Lahachmir and Lahakel. But it's just more when you put your hand together and you make a fist, you can have your fingers tightly next to each other, or you could have them loosely. So he says it's like a face. If you're smiling, then your face is loose. If you're crying, then your face is tight. Although I think there's different opinions about which one means which. But in any case, the idea being that it's just a matter of do we measure the 6 handbreadths by a tight handbreadth or by a looser one. So there's a little bit of a difference between them, but not as much as if it's either 5 or it's 6, where there's a much larger difference. Okay, tomorrow we'll get to some questions on these opinions, and we'll pick up from here. Have a good day, everybody.